Welcome everybody, my name is Damian Brady. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the power of a great API, and more to the point try to convince you that you should be writing your applications with a view to writing the API first. Just a quick shout out before we start to all the sponsors. I know you're going to see this slide a lot, but I run the DDD Brisbane event, and so I know firsthand that these events don't come together without the sponsorship of people like this. So stop in, have a look at what they're going to show you, and be grateful. All right, so today I'm really going to separate it into three different things. I'm going to talk about first why an API is a good thing in the first place, and more specifically why it should be your #1 concern. We're going to have a look at some implementation details about how to actually structure and write your APIs. And then finally I'm going to do a little bit of a demo just to put it all in perspective. So you might have noticed in the title slide, I work for a company called Octopus Deploy. Octopus Deploy is an API-first application, which means the UI sits on top of an API. One thing that I learned when I started there in about April this year is that everybody does support. Now we've got a main support person, Vanessa, and we've got Dalmiro in Argentina as well, but every day one or more developers jump on and they do support with Vanessa. They'll answer customer questions, things like that. This is one of the earliest questions that I got from a customer. I need one button to disable all the machines in an environment. So who here is aware of Octopus Deploy, who uses it? Wow, that's like about 2/3 of the audience, which is awesome. The rest of you start using it. So for those of you who have used Octopus Deploy, this might make sense, but for the ones who haven't, Octopus Deploy is a deployment automation tool. You define environments, like your staging, production environments, and you define machines or deployment targets in those environments. So this person wanted to disable all of the machines in one environment. So this is how you would normally do it. I've got here my development environment. I'd move my mouse over, I'd click on my machine that I want to disable, scroll down a little bit, click the disable checkbox, click save, and then I've got this disabled machine in that environment, which is fine, right? But what if your environment looks like this? Which is the case in this circumstance. There was about 200 machines in the environment. Now, I'll point out that this is really, really rare. Usually, on average, according to our current stats, it's between 2 and 3 machines per environment. And disabling a machine is pretty rare as well. Like, you only do that if it's temporarily not available, for example. So these kind of combine to give us what we call a bit of a snowflake scenario. It's a bit rare. So how do you solve this problem for the customer? What's the solution? Well, usually when something like this comes up, you've got one of two choices. You can say, sorry, you're going to have to click that 200 times because nobody else is going to use this feature. We're not going to build it into the product. Of course, not the best outcome for the customer. And not the best outcome for us either because, we've disappointed this customer who's paid us money for this product. The other alternative is to say, okay, yeah, I could see how that could potentially be useful. We'll add it to the next release. We don't really want to do that either because, this is what happens. So you want to try and balance these things. But because Octopus Deploy is API first, we've got a third option. And this was the solution that I gave them. Here's a script. I pointed them at a gist that I wrote, which is super hacky, by the way. If you look at it, don't ever write your code like this. But it solved one person's problem. And that problem was, or the solution was, copy all this sort of stuff, paste it into your Chrome console, and it's going to add a couple of buttons for you. Whoops. Add an enable all and a disable all button. So that solved that person's problem. It meant that we didn't have to compromise the application. And so it's a bit of a win-win. Now, it's not just about problem solving and support and things like that. Has anybody had this question asked of them? I kind of ruined this by going to the slide early, but has anybody actually been asked to, by a manager or someone, we need an iPhone app, or at least that's been suggested? Yeah, a couple of hands. So I've had this maybe 4 times in my career so far, and this is generally the reaction. You go, well, no, you don't. But the advantage of writing API first is you don't even need to do it. You're writing an application programming interface. So where you normally have a UI, a user interface, you're writing an interface to your application that a program can use, an iPhone app, anything like that. you're kind of writing the equivalent of a power socket, right? Anything can plug into this power socket. It doesn't have to be you that writes the stuff. So the next time a manager comes to you and says, we need an iPhone app, or we need some Office integration, or we need to print this report out every time the temperature goes below 5 degrees, which in Melbourne would be all the freaking time, then you don't have to get together in your developer huddle and try to try to think of the best way to convince your manager that it's a terrible idea. And this has happened time and time again with companies that release APIs. So on the left there, you can see it's an iPhone app called iOctocat. It uses the GitHub API, and it's not written by GitHub, it's written by a third party. On the right, if you're a Reddit user, you might recognize Alien Blue. Now, Alien Blue was originally written by a third party using Reddit's API, but Reddit liked it so much that they acquired it, and now it's the official Reddit app. So essentially, they outsourced it without outsourcing it. Somebody else did it for them, and then they went, yeah, great, we'll buy it. Has anyone heard of this app, Untapped? Only a couple. Wow. Well, if you're coming for drinks later, everybody should install it. It's a social drinking app, basically, which, drinking is generally a social event anyway, one would hope. But it lets you check in the beers that you're drinking at a particular venue, right? It uses a few APIs. It pulls venue information from the Foursquare API. You might be familiar with Foursquare. And it also talks to the Twitter API and Facebook APIs, both to get your friends and to push out the information about what you're drinking and where. But somebody put me onto another application recently called NowTapped. Now, being in Melbourne, you'd be aware that there's thousands and thousands of craft beers out there, and a lot of pubs now aren't content with putting VB and Carlton on their taps, and that's it. So they'll put craft beers on, but they have to rotate them a lot because they're craft beers, they don't make a lot of them. NowTapped gives you a venue, and it tells you what's on tap at that venue right now. Now, not every venue participates in this, so they use the Untapped API to have a look at what people have checked in recently. If somebody's checked in a particular beer at this venue, there's a good chance that it's on tap at the moment. So they use that information as well. So this kind of web and this kind of ecosystem wouldn't exist if it wasn't API-driven applications. Now, all of these applications, you might be familiar with a lot of them. Some of them are sponsors. I made sure to get some sponsors on there. All of these expose APIs. And it's important to note that just because you're exposing an API doesn't mean it's a free-for-all with the information that you broadcast, right? Some of these, Seek, for example, MailChimp, Visual Studio Online, you can't really do a lot with them unless you're already paying for the service. So exposing an API doesn't really mean, oh, we're letting anybody use our application. You can still restrict it to your customers as well. And the other important point is API does not necessarily mean public API. If you write your application API first, you might only choose to expose that API to other applications within your company, whether that be through DLLs or through command line or through HTTP. You don't have to expose this to the outside world, but you still get the benefits of being able to do that down the track if you want, and being able to get other departments or other dev teams to use your application without having to hack around in your precious code. So let's talk implementation. So different ways of writing an API. Now, everybody here is a good developer because you wouldn't be coming to DDD Melbourne if you weren't. So you all layer your applications, right? You have your UI and your business layers and your data layers and all that kind of stuff as well. Obviously, your exceptions just get thrown into a deep, dark hole at the bottom. All right, maybe not. So what the customer sees, or what the users of your application see, is what's above the waterline, that beautiful, pristine, white, glowing thing. Because underneath the surface is a lot of stuff that can kill you and scare you. So you don't want the user to see that kind of stuff. We're not talking about bringing this iceberg up and putting it above the water. What we're talking about is just raising that bar a little bit and letting some of your business layer poke above the surface of the water so it's accessible to the outside world. And of course, you can polish up that bit as well. It doesn't have to be raw business layer functions. So when you're writing an API-first application, what that means, and if there's one thing I want you to take away, what that means is when you write your application, focus on the functions of your application. Don't focus on the customer maintenance screen. focus on the customer maintenance functions. So write your API and have all your layers below it, that's fine, however you want to do that, it's not part of this talk, but have your API on top, and then make your UI talk to that API. Now, if you've already got an application and you're thinking, well, this is fantastic, but we have a 25-year ported from VB application that's not going to be able to do this, just think about how you might be able to benefit from it anyway. Try and expose your business layer a little bit. So raise that iceberg just a little bit to let it poke out of the water. That might mean you need to refactor to add this API layer. And ideally, you want your UI to talk through that API layer. But we live in the real world, and that might not be possible. There might be some pretty hard binding there. What you really want there, though, is one layer at the top of your business layer that's, that represents the functions that you want to call, the functions that you might want to expose to a third party. The important thing here, though, is that there should be one code path. So I should never get different behavior when I click the save button for a customer screen in my application versus I hit the save endpoint for a customer in my application. It should all run through the same endpoint. And that might mean doing some things in depth. So validation is a great example. Validation people usually put on the client side, on the UI as well, because it's quicker. You want to make sure that they're going to submit decent data, but also do that validation in the business layer. So if somebody does hit that API directly, you get the same kind of validation. That's not going to stop you doing that. It might mean you might need to do a bit of this, though, a bit of yak shaving. If you have an existing application, yeah, there might be a bit of work, but it'll be worth it. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this implementation, but HTTP is really, really easy. Just as an example of other ways you can do it, getting back to Octopus Deploy, when you do any configuration stuff, you get a nice UI to step through, but right at the end, it just runs scripts. It just calls an executable with some arguments, and that's essentially an API. It's a management API. You're calling into an application, passing known data, and it's having an effect. So that's an API as well. So I'm going to talk a lot about HTTP, but I just want to mention the fact that it's not just HTTP. If you come to James Newton King's talk later on today, which I'd highly recommend, he'll talk about other APIs as well. If you're writing a Windows app or something like that, you might be thinking, well, that's fantastic. I can't expose HTTP because I'm writing a Windows app, and I'm not even using IIS. I don't even know how. You don't have to. There's some really good tools like OWIN now, and or frameworks OWIN and NancyFX as well, puts a nice lightweight web layer over the top. And we'll see how we can use those later. Essentially, it just means you open up a port and respond to HTTP requests. I'll use these lines when we do the demo later. You'll see how easy it is. All right, when you were listening to Daryl before, he probably mentioned a whole lot of keywords about different types of APIs as well. In general, the way that I've found you could talk about APIs is it's one of three different types. There's your kind of HTTP RPC model, which ultimately just means you're exposing method calls over HTTP, right? You're letting people call methods in your application. It's pretty straightforward. Obviously, it's HTTP, it's got to be request response, so all your void methods have to return some kind of acknowledgement. REST is the one that everybody thinks of. I do that every single time. Representational state transfer. And it's resource-based URLs. You talk about a customer resource and an order resource, for example. Use HTTP verbs to talk about what you're doing with that resource, and it's stateless as well. Now, REST has been, as Daryl mentioned, has been acquired by tons of stuff, and this is what it means and this is what it doesn't mean. It's not really important, just as long as you're consistent. And then HADOS, which, again, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, hypermedia as the engine of application state, which is more or less REST plus links. So if you think about the web in general, the web is a bunch of pages with links in between them for related data and related information. HADOS takes REST and it says, I'm giving you this customer information, but I'm also giving you links to relevant things you can do with that customer information, relevant bits of information about that customer. That's more or less all it means. The idea being that it's self-describing. It's a self-describing way of doing things. You're not returning a customer, you're also returning the things you can do with that customer. These are really high level, by the way. Diving into these could be its own 3-hour talk. Some examples, for example, the Flickr API uses a kind of a RPC model. And yes, I know it says REST in the URL. Doesn't really mean they're doing it. Essentially, you're just calling a method. So here we've got an example. We're calling the flickr.photos.search method, and we're passing in a text argument. And it gives us some information. Don't worry about the fact that it's XML. They do actually return JSON and other things as well. RESTful APIs are things like Spotify, for example. In this case, we're asking for the artist resource, and here's the identifier for that artist. Anyone know who that is? No, I'm kidding. It's John Farnham, and I remembered that. I can type it by heart. So it gives us some links, but it's not really giving us information about what to do with John Farnham, which, oh, no, okay, I'll leave that there. So it gives us links, it gives us some images and things like that, but it doesn't tell you things like, oh, here's how you go to his albums, or here's how you add his albums to your playlist, or anything like that. It's really just request response, here's the state of your John Farnham data at any one point in time. HADOS is more and more common, that kind of concept of traversable links between resources. So the GitHub API is a great example. You hit the api.github.com, and you get just a bunch of links telling you what you can do from here. So if we go to the emojis URL, a lot of these, by the way, need authorization because it doesn't make sense if you don't. But the emojis one doesn't, thankfully. So if you went to that emojis URL, you'd get this, another section, another chunk of data which points you at the images for those emoji codes. So that's an example of the HADOS kind of concept. So which do you use? And the answer, as it always is in IT, is to be pragmatic. People will try to tell you to force your application into a RESTful API, and that's not always the answer. As Daryl mentioned, you know, what was it, service-based, or he had resource-based and then functionality-based. I can't remember the word he used. But that's, you know, if you have a function that doesn't really lend itself to having an object that you send and an object that you return as a resource, then don't try to force that square peg into a round hole. Be pragmatic. Write the API the way it makes sense. In general, that'll mean you'll probably have CRUD operations for your resources. So I want to get a customer, I want to save a customer, I want to create a customer, things like that. But you'll also have these sensible functions that make sense for your domain. Obviously, CRUD roughly translates to HTTP verbs of post, get, put, delete. So if we give an example of getting a customer as well, we run into the point of, well, what does a customer look like in the context of our API? So there's a customer there, right? But customers also kind of have addresses, right? So, all right, we'll return that customer. They also have orders. And you can see how this can kind of spiral out of control. There's a few ways to handle this. In general, I'd take Daryl's advice and just evolve it. Start with a customer object and have HADOS-style links to where you can get the addresses. But if you want, like, you can add this kind of levels of detail that people can request. And again, it's about being pragmatic. Don't force people to only get this version of the application if they always, when they hit a customer, they always go and get the addresses. But at the same time, don't end up with 35 different levels of detail for a customer. It doesn't make sense. When you're actually implementing this, regardless of how you do it, it's important you use separate classes that represent these resources for your API. And the reason is you don't want to bind them to the logic that's behind the API, to your business logic. So if you want to change your customer logic, so your date of birth stored in a different object or something like that, you still want your API to be able to return the original customer object that people wanted. All right. There's some other ways that you can, oh, this has gone flat. Help. There is another one in here. I'll just yell in the meantime. All right. If anyone can find Lars. Yeah, thanks. I'll yell in the meantime. There's some other ways that you can return information as well. Can everyone hear me? Projecting. There's some other ways you can return data. There's things like OData. And OData is a great way of letting somebody do whatever they want with your data. I'm really not a fan of OData. You're passing control over what queries and what collections of data are made available to you. You're passing that control to the client. And it's my data. I don't want somebody to run a 10-minute query on something. I want to control what's there. Incidentally, the Visual Studio Online, the first API they ever released for looking at work items and things like that was an OData API. And they kind of shut it down after a little bit because people were running 10-minute long queries and it was nuking their servers. All right, let's get this one working. How's that? No? Nothing? How's that? Oh, wow. Yeah. Super loud. All right, don't worry, you didn't miss anything important. So I'm not a big fan of this. I think as a developer, you should be able to control what people get from your API. There is another interesting one along the same lines that Facebook's looking at called GraphQL, which came to my attention courtesy of another guy at Octopus. And the GraphQL one basically means that you're passing the decision to the client about what shape the data is that you return. So where before we were talking about a customer object being this small bit of information or that bit of information with addresses and things like that, when you make the request, you can say, I want the customer object, but I only want the ID and the first name and some addresses. And then the server side will do whatever processing it needs to do and send back the data shaped in that particular way, which is a nice idea. But when I think about how you'd implement that on the server side, I don't know how that works. Facebook could probably do it though. There's a few more things with APIs just before we move on about how they might hurt you. Each one of these, I just want to point out up front, could be a talk in itself. So I'm not going to go into a lot of depth. Long-running tasks will come up very early. So things like, I want to run this task which would normally take 5 minutes, generating a report or something like that. A good strategy, and one that we use pretty regularly at Octopus, is to have a kind of a task response to say, okay, cool, I'm doing that. Come back and check periodically so I can tell you when it's done. So eventually they'll make the request and it'll say, yeah, here you go, here's the resource you want, or just here's the resource now. Security. If you really cared about security, you'd be watching Troy Hunt now. I'm kidding. No, I'm kidding. Security is its own talk, and it's its own conference, and I'm not going to touch on it a great deal, except to say that whether you use single sign-on SAML tokens or OAuth 2 or basic auth or something like that, they're all fine. Just make sure you do your research. If you really want to know about API security, did everyone get a Pluralsight voucher thing in the bag? Yeah, use that. Have a look for a course by Dominic Bayer. He does a lot of stuff around API security, and so I'm not going to tread on his toes. You should have a look at him. So have a look at that sort of stuff. One way that is really increasingly common that I see is the idea of a personal access token or an API token, which means that you as a user can generate a token, and that token will be able to be passed in with an HTTP request, and then that request acts as you. So it has the same permissions that you do. It doesn't have to be all the permissions either. This is the Visual Studio Online generating a personal access token, which got added a month ago. So you can scope it and say, yes, this token can be used to act as me, but only as far as reading this particular bit of information. If done properly, which is generally fairly easy to do, it's a really secure way of getting an easy result. It's really easy to consume your API using a public access token, and it's really easy to revert them. It provides decent security for very low cost, so it's a good way to go. Versioning, you might have got the hint from Daryl's talk this morning that versioning sucks. I'd be the stupidest person in the room if I went against what Daryl Miller said about APIs, but think about versioning up front. it's wonderful to say your API is never going to change, but it is going to change. Don't have to write it that way to start off with, but at least know what you're going to do when that comes up. How many versions of the API are you going to support? Are you going to support backwards compatibility? Things like that. Again, use your Pluralsight vouchers. Have a look at an API design talk by Sean Wildermuth. He has a 20-minute chapter on API versioning alone. So that's definitely worth watching if you want to drill into that a bit more. Caching. Ultimately, if you're doing HTTP stuff for caching, then you're going to have, HTTP stuff for your API, then you're going to have to think about caching. I'll leave it at that. That's a web thing. You'll all know about that. And content negotiation, which Darryl also touched on, which is to do with the client saying, I want this resource, and here are the languages that I understand. I understand XML and JSON and whatever else. If you don't want to bother with content negotiation, just use JSON. Everything talks JSON, seriously. If you have XML, to wrap it in JSON. I'm kidding. Don't do that. All right. There's some other architecture keywords that you'll hear about when talking about APIs, and James Newton King is going to go into some of these in a bit more detail with API design later on in the context of .NET APIs. But things like the principle of least surprise, letting people fall into the pit of success, things like that. Even like being conservative in what you send, be liberal in what you in what you accept, things like that. All of it really just boils down to being predictable. So, for example, with your URLs or your URIs, don't have a customer's URI and an order URI. Be consistent with these things. If one function does a similar thing to another function, its URI should look the same. Don't make people guess. Same thing goes for consistent objects. If you're returning a customer object somewhere, don't make it look completely different than the customer object you return elsewhere, all right? That's just going to confuse people. Just be consistent. I'm not going to tell you how you should make your customers look, but that sounds wrong. Not sure about, I'm not going to tell you how to do it, just make sure you think about it and make sure you're consistent. Not doing this stuff is a great way to write an API that people hate. All right, so I've talked enough about it. Let's actually do some of this stuff. And here's where the demo gods start. All right, so I mentioned before that you don't have to be writing for the web, and that's true, so I'm going to start with a console app. So can everybody see the screen okay? Yep. I have the advantage of the world's largest projector screen behind me. It's gone. All right, we're going to call this sample questions. And I'll explain why in a sec. I'll explain why now. My wife is a doctor, she's an anaesthetist, and she's heading for her final exams, her fellowship exams now. The first one is in a couple of weeks. And that means she has to learn everything, apparently. So she got this collection of like 500 sample short answer questions, and she's been using them. She'll grab some random ones, and then she'll do an exam condition style exam for it. So I grabbed this data that she had, and I filtered it and turned it into a JSON object, and then just wrote a little app which grabs a random set of questions and delivers it to her so she can do her exams. Pretty straightforward thing, but an easy thing, and something that helped her definitely. All right, I'm just going to grab the notes that I forgot to get out. But what we're going to do here, first of all, I'm just going to do like a hello world, because that's how every demo starts. So the first thing we want to do is we want to take our console app and we want to expose an HTTP endpoint. So let's go to the package manager console, and we're going to, I'm missing one. What am I looking for? How do I install a package? Somebody install. Good start, hey? Install package, and we're going to do those two lines that I mentioned before. If we get, there we go, we have internet. So just to zoom in a little bit, Microsoft OWin self-host is the one we're going to use. So basically this adds the ability to self-host an OWin style HTTP endpoint. You don't really need to know too much about it. Honestly, just copy these two install things and everything will be fine. And one more that I want to do, I want to use Nancy. And I want to get Nancy to host itself on OWIN. All of these, by the way, all of these steps that I'm going to go through are in GitHub. If you have a look at Damo Visa in GitHub, same as my Twitter handle, they're all there, and the commits should map roughly with the steps I'm taking, so you can step through it at your own pace. Okay, so to turn my console app into a web API, I'm going to do this. I'm going to use OWIN. We also need an OWIN startup class as well. Luckily, Visual Studio knows how to do everything, so I don't need to learn how to code. Don't tell my boss I said that. And what we're going to do here is app.useNancy. So Nancy, OWIN adds another, basically just an OWIN pipeline that we can use to say we're using Nancy now. One more thing we've got to do for our Hello World is to create a Nancy module. I'll call it API module, and that can inherit from Nancy module. Make that public. And we're going to say that returns a function which returns hello world. Now you can examine this at your own leisure. I'm just kind of conscious of time, seeing as we started late. But essentially what this is going to do is it's going to say, right, I am going to expose an endpoint where if somebody goes to, let's just make it a bit more explicit, if somebody goes to the root of that, then I'm going to return hello world. So let's press F5. And we'll go to, oh, there we go, we've started up. Here's a great start page for Chrome, by the way. It's called Memento or something, or Moment, something like that. So we're going to go to localhost 12345. And we get hello world. Oops. Hooray. Whoa, the zoom does not work well like this. Okay, let's forget about zooming. Hey. Everything. That actually came apart. It's not flashing anymore. How many backups do we have? Just the one? Is this one charged? Oh, hey. All right, third time lucky. Yep, I really broke that one. Okay. Great demo on breaking things, code works. Okay, so that's not really an API. Let's make it a little bit more API and return an actual bit of data. So a new, what do we want? API result or something. And we'll give it text of hello world. And then I'm going to just make ReSharper to do all my work for me. So I'm going to press F5 now. I'm going to go back here and refresh. And you'd think we would get an object, right? But we get this lovely 500 internal error because we've asked specifically for an HTML file. We said we understand text HTML, and it's used content negotiation to say, well, you've got this object. Nancy doesn't know how to render. It doesn't have a object. So if I asked, there's a couple of ways I can do this. I can ask specifically for a JSON object, just by saying .json, which is kind of content negotiation. Or I can just ask for that using a tool called Postman. Can everyone see that? Yep. And so it's going to give me this JSON object. I can also say I only accept application XML. So I'm saying I want this media type, and it will return me an internal server error because that's an internal class. knew I'd forget something. Second time lucky. There we go. Now we get XML. So we're letting the client decide, send a message saying, I understand JSON or I understand XML. That makes sense? Yep. So it's not really an API. We haven't really solved my wife's issues at all, which happens a lot. Sorry, bad joke. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm just going to include stuff that I've already done. So we've got here this questions JSON object, which contains all of these questions. And I'm going to, just because of the way I'm doing it, I'm going to include that. And I've got my questions repository as well, which has two methods. There's a get question method, and then there's a get random questions method. It's just reading from that embedded resource. So sorry, that was the wrong thing to do. Oops. We want this to be an embedded resource. We can still copy it, that's fine. And the other thing we need to do is, why am I forgetting this? I do this all the time. I don't know why Newtonsoft JSON isn't installed by default in any type of project you ever write. Okay, there we go. So now we've got this data business layer thing that I've got there, right? I'm going to change my API module so that now I'm going to expose a couple of endpoints. And I won't make you suffer through my typing. I'm just going to do that. So we're going to create a question repository, which is kind of our business data stuff. We're going to expose an endpoint API questions, which will just return the results from our get random questions. And then we're going to let you request a single question as well. We don't need this class anymore. So let's just run that. So what should happen, it should expose those two endpoints and let us hit them with things like API questions. If we send that, we get a 404 because we don't have an XML. Do that again. Aren't you glad that I'm not like typing code at your company? So we get this JSON collection of JSON objects back with an ID and a question. If we go to a particular, like an individual question, you can see both just the single question, and you can also see why it takes an anaesthetist tons of years to actually get through anesthetics. So that, yeah, that's our API. So you can expose this API and then let any client access it. Make sense? Now, if you wanted to do a HATOS style thing as well, so have some links to other stuff you can do. I'm just going to do a really basic example of this. There's much, much more elegant ways to do it. There was a tweet today that I retweeted about having, so there's packages for HAL and what else? Siren and things like that, but also JSON plus collections as a Nancy plugin as well. So you can get it to do this stuff in a much more elegant way than I'm about to do. But let's go and we'll create these API-specific objects that I said were really important. So we'll have a look at our short answer question, which currently is just ID and question. And once again, I don't want you to watch me type. So we've got this decorated short answer question. And it just inherits from this, not because it has to inherit from it, just because it was easier for me to implement. And it also has an ID property and a question property, but it also has a links property. And that links property has one property inside it, which is a self-link. Now this is one way you could expose the links. It's not one of the standard ones like HAL or Siren or Maven, something like that. It's not one of the standard ones, but it just serves to demonstrate how this works. So the other thing we need to do to get this to work, obviously for our API module, we need to return one of those. So for these random ones, we want to select a new decorated short answer question. And I actually have to do this a little bit differently. We want to return one of these. Otherwise, return a new All right, so all we're doing is we're taking this business object and we're turning it into an object that our API wants to return. So we should get more or less the same thing when we do this, but we'll just get some links as well to make it a little bit more along the Hados style of API. So let's go back to the questions API, the random ones. And we see we get more or less the same thing. We get a collection of objects with an ID and a question. But we also get some more information about how to get, maybe more information about this particular question. Now this link that I've got isn't terribly useful. I mean, it is in the context of this. If you wanted to drill in and just return that question, you could follow that URL and get just that question. And maybe there's more information there. Maybe there's a bit more detail. But you'd also have things like, here's the URL you go to get questions that relate to the words in this question, for example, if that's something you wanted to expose. Or a link to a search page, search API, or something like that. So you can see how these things kind of fit together, right? Cool, still with me? Still got a couple of minutes, so let's actually build, I said API first, not API only, so let's build an API over the top. And once again, I'm going to cheat. I just need to make that, I'm going to cheat completely and use jQuery. So we're going to do that, and we're also going to create a view. Who uses Nancy, by the way? Only a couple of hands? If you want to write a really quick API for something, it's an excellent way to do it. Obviously, you don't need very much skill. Self-deprecating humor works, right? Okay, so we've got an index view, and now I'm going to just cheat again. So all we're doing is we're giving it a title and an empty collection, right? But then when the page loads, we're hitting our API/questions, and we're filling it up with the questions that we get back. Really, really simple use of the API. And again, in a real application, you wouldn't do straight jQuery hitting it like this. This is just an example. One more thing, we need a module for that. So let's add a new class called questions module. Fix my code, resharper. Oops. And then our get method will be a function that returns a view for the index. So again, this is kind of Nancy specific, but all we're doing is saying when you hit that URL, return this view. Do I need to do anything else? I need to make that copy. All right, let's try that. Okay, we're up and running. Let's hit this raw URL, and we get a 10 random questions. Thank you. The important thing here, though, is to have a look at what it's actually doing. Now, it's a little bit annoying that my zoom tool's not going to work, because this is going to be hard to read. But if I refresh this, you should be able to see. That's the zoom tool. Handy, isn't it? Is there another zoom tool built into Windows 10? Yep. Yep, cool. What you'll see, though, is you'll get our empty empty HTML page, and then a separate request to the API where you can see, oh, there we go. We can see that same results that you get from the API. So we're building on top of our API, just the way we thought about before. All right, I've been given several wrap-ups now, so. Just to recap, and again, the code is available on GitHub if you want to have a look in a bit more detail. We had a look at why you do an API in the first place, why it's a good thing. Had a look at some of the details about implementation, and then finally we just had a look at a demo of some of the concepts about writing API first. And that's me. Thanks.